what we will do today is talk about elements. We will pick up from where we were last week with where you started to write little texts around the circle and the line, and also numbers and letters. So I really liked what you were doing, and I've saved the chat, so we've got a record of what you were writing last week. I'll do the same again, but I do think, like I said, I think you should keep a record of what you have written. So in order to push this a little bit further, I think what we need to do is look at what these elements actually are and how they relate to one another in relation to a wider scheme of, or scheme being a really important word here, in relation to a wider scheme, whatever that scheme may be. So I'll talk through some different types of elements, and then the different ways in which elements can be scaled, can be arranged, can be presented, can be articulated, and can be played around with in different ways in order to say something. So what we were doing with the numbers and the letters and the circle and the line was that you were starting to experiment, to see how it felt to write with these kinds of characters or elements. And you may, I mean, I'll be interested to know how you found this. We can have a discussion after I've talked you through these things. But one thing which it might have felt quite difficult to do would be to say something kind of serious, or maybe you felt that it was easier to make a kind of joke or say something playful, which absolutely is fine. I wondered how it would be, or whether it would be possible to write something which is both going in the direction of seriousness and going in the direction of playfulness. So that's what we're going to have a go at doing today. And we will look at some more kind of pairs of elements, because the circle and the line play together, and the numbers and the letters play together in this particular scheme of the text from Ludger, which we've been looking at. So what I gave you to look at, to read for this week, was both the final part of Ludger's text, where he has lots of these pairs of inverted concepts or elements. And then I gave you the table, which is the schema for the novel I'm writing, which gives you a different way of organizing a story into elements, various elements, and then putting them together. So firstly then, how are we even talking about elements, and how can we define this word? So generally, and I would say it's good to think about all different time periods simultaneously. So we can think about a classical division of elements that you would get in someone like Aristotle or an ancient Greek thinker, with earth, air, fire, and water. And there are other ones which, depending on which kind of cosmology you're thinking at, there are other ones you could add, such as this fifth element, or ether. Just want to make sure, is everybody muted? Thank you. And then, so this fifth element of ether, or you could also substitute that for void in some kinds of maybe alchemical thinking, and also metal and wood come into some types of Chinese thinking around elements. So there are various ways of dividing these things, and you can also think of air as wind. Those could be interchangeable. And the reason why I have this cartoon picture here is because I've found this a very helpful illustration of elements. And it comes from a cartoon which I watched when I was a kid, probably none of you, because I'm older than most of you. And this is Captain Planet. I don't know if anyone knows Captain Planet. I've talked about Captain Planet before and nobody had heard of him or this series. So he was this very cool superhero who was saving the planet, and he had this green mullet hairdo. And he had these 5 characters who were the Planeteers, and they each represent an element, and they're each from a different part of the world. And as you can see there, there is a nice table which is kind of describing each character. There are 5 here. So we have earth, fire, water, wind, and then heart, which is maybe the most kind of strange one that you might not expect. But these are a nice example of a personification or a characterization or a dramatization of elements in the classical sense. So that shows a kind of pervasiveness of the classical idea of what elements are. That they were still being fictionalized in this way in the 90s. And then also in a kind of Elizabethan, or by UK standards, Elizabethan period in the medicine of the time, the elements were also used and split into 4 humors with earth, fire, water, and air. Being 4 substances of the body, and the medicine was about balancing the levels of those substances in the body, and that's something which you may have heard of before. So this is classical elements and how they continue to be important in dividing up the world. What about chemical elements? So we have the periodic table. And again, another way of dividing up the world and arranging the world in a table. We have here different elements, chemical elements. And an element in this sense can't be split, as you probably know, can't be split down any further because it's a pure substance. Each of these is a different substance made up of only of atoms with the same number of protons in their nucleus. So this is another kind of pure essential kind of element from chemistry. And this concept of the periodic table is quite inspiring, I would say, to people who are thinking outside of the chemistry discipline. Even just the concept of a table and putting things in a table is something which can be useful for us as writers. Well, if we're experimenting in creative writing. So how might you experiment with this then? Well, just to give you 2 brief examples, which I like. We have here, and these are the more playful elements before we get to the concepts from Ludger, which we will look at a little bit later. So we have this element from a novel from the 1960s, which I highly recommend. It's a funny, kind of surreal, maybe slightly existentialist kind of novel called The Third Policeman, by an Irish writer called Flann O'Brien. And I'll just read this little extract for you. You are Omnium and I am Omnium, and so is the mangle and my boots here, and so is the wind in the chimney. That is enlightening, I said. It comes in waves, he explained. Some people, he said, call it energy, but the right name is Omnium, because there is far more energy in the inside of it, whatever it is. Omnium is the essential inherent interior essence which is hidden inside the root of the kernel of everything, and it is always the same. Some people call it God. So in this example, Omnium is a fictional element. It doesn't exist in the periodic table, but it's somehow representative of everything. And there are various ways that we could interpret this. In a theological way, that's why the character says some people call it God as the final kind of inherent essence of everything. Other people might say other things, maybe to do with the laws of physics or invariance of energy, these kind of things. So this is a playful, speculative, fictional element. So that's one example. And the next one comes from a more theoretical book. This is from an excellent book. This isn't a novel. This is a kind of music theory book by Codwo Eshun, written in the 1990s. And it's another really great book, which I highly recommend. It's about kind of electronic music and theorizing electronic music from a kind of philosophical perspective. And he says, he's talking about a DJ called, Future, or OJ Pierre, who made the first acid house track in the 1980s, I guess. And this is what he says, Codwo Eshun. He says, OJ Pierre's heteronym, future, substitutes the F in future for the pH of the chemical formula and the pH of phono. pH makes the future sound synthetic and phonochemical. pH is to sound as silver is to vision. pH is the silver prefix, the word concentrate. The future becomes a futuristic pharmatopia. With future, the sound of the future separates from the look of the future. Vision and sound, heteronym and homonym, split off, run away from each other. So this is quite a complex paragraph here. I think it's fantastic what he's doing, though. So the DJ OJ Pierre, his kind of DJ name is Future, but with a PH. We know that in English, PH sounds like F sometimes. And so to do this with future, it makes a new word, but it's called a homonym because it sounds the same. That's what homonym means. It sounds the same. Future with an F, future with a PH, they sound the same, but they're doing something different. So the idea of the future is still there, but there's something else, something almost like science fiction going on, where this concept of the future is not just a normal concept of the future, it's something else. Because pH, the way that the pH is written there with the small p and the big H, this is reminiscent of a chemical symbol. And that's what's being pointed at here. That's why he says the chemical formula. But what is it the chemical formula for? It's also a speculative kind of writing, because it doesn't exist in the periodic table. Although pH is to sound as silver is to vision. In that one sentence, it's very poetic because there are pH, sound, silver, vision, all being equated with one another in some kind of way. So it's a very quick metaphorical maneuver, and it is kind of looking into the future. It's the future of the beginning of a kind of era of music, electronic music. So it really is futuristic at this time. So there's something going on with the sound of the language and the idea of a speculative element. So I think that's what links it to the previous example. They're both speculative elements here. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Those are two examples. We could talk about others, but let's go on and think about how then new kinds of tables might be created. Because one of the things which I think is interesting here is the way that the idea of putting something in a table seems to be the opposite of a creative act. Why would we want to arrange things in a table of elements? How is this a creative act? I would argue absolutely that it is, because it gets away from a traditional way of a linear narrative. That's one reason why a table might be a creative thing. There are other reasons as well. It might be to do with creating a spectrum of possibilities. So with the periodic table, often it's presented in different colors to show the different types of, I'm not a scientist, but the different groups of types of elements, how heavy they are, or the different properties that they have. They're grouped together according to similarity, and the colors are representing that. But the fact that they're in different colors, and the fact that this does something to our perception, we have a kind of affective relationship to the colors in the periodic table, that is significant. Because there's a kind of spectrum there as well. There's a spectrum, a color spectrum, and there are multiple spectra that are available to us if we might want to place elements into a table. So let's go to this first table then here. This is a table which James Joyce created when he was writing Ulysses in order to help, because it was a difficult text to understand. And he presented this way for a friend of his to help his friend understand the text better. So in this table, you have the names of the chapters, which correspond to sections of Homer's Odyssey. If you remember in the first session, I told you about how James Joyce's Ulysses was a modern retelling of Homer's Odyssey. So these are the Homeric titles. And then you have a scene, which is the place in which the chapter is set. And then you have an hour, because the novel is set over 24 hours in one day. So you have the time. Then you have an organ of the body. And you can see it's an unfinished project, as is my own table, which I'll also show you. But this, Joyce just didn't have an organ of the body to put in each of these rows. He also didn't have a color for each section, but he has some. So it's incomplete in that way, but that doesn't matter because it's still fulfilling a function. And then you have a symbol, an art, and a technique. So, and the art and the technique are also, I would say, symbols of the things which they are depicting there. So there's so much association going on there. And each of these associations is a kind of element to make up the writing as a whole. So, and this is a fantastic thing to see all in one page. I personally found this very inspiring, and I made a table myself, which I sent to you. It's over 2 pages. It's a little bit too big to fit onto one slide. But as you will have already seen, I followed the structure of Joyce's table fairly closely, in that there's also a Homeric title, which is in the same order as Joyce's, and an hour of the day, and an organ of the body, a symbol, a color, and then an art or a technique, which I put together because I think it's nice to see art and techniques together. But then I added a few others, such as a substance, because the novel I'm writing is very much about substances of various kinds, and a formula, whether it's a chemical formula, a mathematical formula, which corresponds somehow to what's going on in the novel, in that chapter, and then the voice, because there are various characters. So this also is splitting up this normal novel linear kind of flow of writing or narrative into a table form, tabular form, and it's a kind of condensation or an abstraction from the normal novel form into a table, and everything is contained in that. You could all write your own novel from that table. And that's something, and you could also all create your own tables with different columns according to what you wanted to write about. So the table itself is a very open form, which enables you to see a lot of information on just in one place. It abstracts it from the passing of time, or chronological time anyway. Okay, so I will show you a few more table examples. This is another table I made for one of the chapters of my novel, which is the 10th chapter, which is a condensation or a microcosm of the whole novel. So because it's a microcosm of the whole novel, it has to have its own table. And then it has to be split into 18 sections, the same as the novel. And so that's it's almost like a logarithmic kind of decreasing of the kind of movement of the novel. So it has, again, slightly different columns and sections and elements, because instead of a different ride at this fun park, which is the site of my novel, it's one ride in this fun park, and it's a different phase of the ride. So you go on the ride as you're reading the chapter. And each section has its own musical track, which is listed there as well. So that's what I'm working on with this. I find it it's great for envisioning what you want to write. So I encourage you to experiment with tables when you're going on with this course. So it doesn't have to be fiction, though. The idea of splitting concepts into tables, it can be done in a philosophical or a theoretical way, such as this example. I hope you can see, and that's big enough. This is a fragment of a modalities map from a colleague of mine from the UK, Felicity Coleman. And these are more scientific, theoretical, philosophical concepts, which she has placed into a table of modalities. So a modality is a particular way of expressing something in language. So, and what she has done is she has listed these in alphabetical order, and then kind of scaled them by process or method, and then put names of thinkers and writers who have used these modalities, and then artifacts such as the kind of products of these kind of modalities. It's a really dense piece of work there. There's so much information there. We don't need to spend a lot of time looking at the different things, but there's a lot going on in there. So if you look at For example, let's just look at biological. So about what could a biological modality be? There are processes which she then lists that are to do with biology. Autopoiesis, agriculture, domestic labor, militarism, demographics. They're all to do with biological, socio-biological processes in the world. And then people who have written about this, Bateson, Haraway, Gregory Bateson, Donna Haraway, Lynn Margulis, Maturana Varela, and Norbert Weiner. So these are thinkers of these kind of biological theories. And then you have agriculture, cybernetics, feminism, health, and the military. And these are all the artifacts, or the kind of, artifacts is the best way, the objects, the things, the systems, institutions in the world, which are kind of articulated by a biological modality. So that's just one example, and it shows you just the ways the world is inflected in different modalities. So this was another thing I found very helpful for my thinking. So I also made a table of modalities, but they are specifically to do with the senses, because this is something that I work on a lot. The sensory perception and the ways that we perceive the world, traditionally through the 5 senses of visual or optic, auditory or oral, olfactory, gustatory or haptic, tactile, see, smell, taste, touch. What did I miss out? Taste, touch, smell, hear, see, that's it. So this is then a table of sensory modalities. You have the sensory system, and then you have the organ, which senses. So the eye is the organ of seeing, for example. Then you have symbols, which somehow represent the sense. How it's expressed in Greek or Latin, any deities or mythological figures which are attributed to this sense, any poetic or religious connotations, any philosophers or writers who've written about this, and then the ways in which it's scaled or discretized in the world to our knowledge, to my knowledge. So I said scale, spectra, unit, or quanta. So it's a blend of scientific perspective and thinking about something in quite a speculative way, because none of these tables are, in comparison to the periodic table, these more speculative tables they're not finalizing something. It would be fine to add something to this table, for example. And that's one thing to hold in your minds when you're writing. You don't need to feel as though you're writing the final element of something. Things can be changed, things do change. So I hope that makes some sense and doesn't feel too dry and kind of structural to you. I think using tables in this way can be really opening. They can be an opening function and not a closing function in terms of how you might feel inspired to write. So keeping with sensory modalities, and then trying to think about how this can be complexified further. Something I work with is synesthesia, a condition in which someone experiences things through their senses in an unusual way. For example, by experiencing a color as a sound or a number as a position in space. So feeling together, synesthesis. This is something is eternally fascinating for me. I don't know if anyone has synesthetic experiences themselves in this group. If you do, please tell me, because I will want to hear all about it. But I find it really useful. I don't have synesthesia, but I try to express it in writing all the time, or not just in writing. In any artistic output is often tending towards the condition of synesthesia, where you try to make one thing feel as another sense. So this is a way that we can calibrate our writing. So this, I put here on this slide a quote from Arthur Rimbaud, who said quite famously, "The poet makes himself a seer by a long, gigantic and rational derangement of all the senses." Maybe you've heard that quotation before, I don't know. But this is a derangement of the senses, is precisely a kind of going towards synesthesia, where all the senses start getting crossing over one another, or entangling with one another, so that then it becomes less clear what's a sound, what's a sight, what's a smell, and what's a tactile sensation. So I find this very, very helpful when I'm thinking about writing the senses, and the ways in which both colour and sound are scaled and measured and counted. They're also in different spectrums. The music scale, the colour scale, the ways in which these can be played around with, such as that keyboard you can see there, which was a keyboard developed by a Russian composer, Alexander Scriabin, in the early 20th century, in which each note on the keyboard corresponded to those colours. So that's in itself is a fascinating attempt, whether you believe it, whether you think it's wrong, whether you think it's an impossible task, just the attributing of the colour to the sound is fascinating. So we've gone from tables then to crossing over categories in tables to synesthetic experiments. These are all just to get you starting to think about elements and how elements can be categorized and organized and presented. Let's now turn to the text from Ludger and a little section from the part that I sent to you, which I hope everybody received. So how Ludger is, this is not a table, but this is a list of pairs of inverted elements. So this is important. What we were doing last week was, when we were working with the number and the numbers and the letters and the circle and the line, we were doing the first stage of the process, which is that we were attempting to articulate those elements, to make them come alive and to make them speak, which you were doing all really nicely. The next step is to see these things and to write about these things as pairs of inversions. And this is when it starts to get more lively, because the concepts which we have here are a little more complex than what we had last week, and they're all in pairs. So there's something about the relationship between the black and the grey coloured concepts. Analysis is to logic, like arithmetic to geometry, like engineering to architecture, like engine to machine, like hand to voice, like ear to eye, like night to day, like every to any, like design to architecture, like interface to communication, like program to code, like prose to poesy, like language to talking, like fiction to drama. And it gets more and more stable, and there is more and more to talk about. You should also be aware that these pairs should not be read as black and white. You should read them as inside out, which is unusual and complicated to think. So it's not like black and white. They're not like opposite poles in that way. They are pairs of inversions. So let's go on and see, because if this is something, it's worth spending a little bit of time to try to grasp what's being said here. So how are these inversions articulated? It goes on and says, in language, inversions are articulated by attributes. What does that mean? You can say logic is inverse to algebra. So you can say logic is algebraic, or a type is characteristic and a character is typical. So you can see how type and typical, these are linked words, but they are inversions of one another, because if you add an attribute, an attribute is the end of the word from type to typical. You see how type, they both begin with this type, tip, and then typical makes it an inversion of the word. This happens again with two other examples that Ludger gives here. Something-ology applied to a day term, and he calls the terms in grey the day terms and the terms in black the night terms. Sticking with day and night as the prototypes is helpful, I think. So if you add ology onto the end of a day term, it inverts it to a night term. So idea is in the day, becomes ideology in the night. Technique in the day becomes technology in the night. Same with the other ones. Here we have stable and stability, history and historicity, and then urban, urbs and urban or urbanism. So all of these different little morphemes to add to the words, icity, ility, ology, and then the same with ness, complete and completeness, correct and correctness. So the way that these inversions work, it's that, so any and every are also inverted terms. That X is not any X, and X is not every X. So don't worry if you're a little bit lost by that point. If you can see how the way, let's just stick with the concept of inversions and inverted terms, and the way in which the linguistic addition, the attribute, Ludger calls it, this is creating an inversion of that concept. That, if just hold on to those parts for now. And then to finish this part, we can do this with subjects and objectivity, because as humans traditionally, we are objects of subjectivity because we think that our brain thinks. But if we invert that, invert object and subject, it's instead of this inner psychoanalytic it, this then becomes an outer climactic it. And so we are thinking with the world rather than thinking with just ourselves. And this is one of the things which we're interested in articulating in this course. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Don't worry if you're not completely with that. These are the things which it would be nice to try and play around with today in our writing. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now, and we can do some talking and some writing.